Welcome to another broadcast from mindyourhealthcast.com. Remember that the last broadcast we had, the discussion was all about placebo and nocebo. And what do you think? Today we want to explore it just a bit farther. Last time we did discuss the definition of placebo, which means, of course, I please or I shall please, and nocebo being just the opposite. Now, I think in order to make it easy to understand and remember, we think of placebo as to be better or health, and nocebo to be worse or sick. So basically it has to do with an effect and, of course, a substance. This placebo could be a pill, it could be a device, it could be a picture, it could be touching you and saying this is going to have a major effect on you. It could be surgery. It could be anything is the placebo. The effect is how you respond. And of course, even thinking can be a cause. In other words, a placebo. And we're going to get into that more because before it's over, we're going to find that there's a whole lot more involved in placebo and nocebo than is discussed by the medical establishment. They concede that it has something to do with belief, which means immediately it puts it into the mental side. And so the placebo effect is taking place in the belief of the person. And I give you a couple of examples. I mentioned that an acquaintance of mine came out with a product several years ago without getting into all the details. Bottom line was that, now when I say an acquaintance, I know his work. I really don't know him personally. I've met some of the people involved with the field, but him I have not met personally. But at any rate, I've listened to a huge number of his recordings and read his books, and he is very, very mischievous sometimes. And so he put out a product called placebo. And it was just a pill, and it said placebo on the label. The back of it said active ingredients none, and it said indications none. In other words, it was just what it said, placebo. Now, interestingly, when it was out on the shelf, people bought it and took it. And after a while, he started getting some calls from people saying, wow, this stuff works pretty good. And people took it for whatever they wanted. It didn't even say for this, that, or anything. There were no indications. And so consequently, they were getting a good response from it. And so he decided to carry it a step farther and put out a second product called Placebo Extra Strength, because he said some people might want something stronger. And so people started buying it and said, wow, this stuff is really good. And after a while, unfortunately, the FDA stopped him from selling it, and he said, well, why is that? It's properly labeled. It says it's placebo. It says that there are no active ingredients and no indications. And they said, yeah, we know, but it's going to give people the wrong idea. Of course, I know what they were doing. They were protecting the medical interest because a high percentage of the effect of most of the medications on the market are placebo. And as I mentioned before, when they have to be tested before they can go on the market, they have to exceed placebo. In most cases, not very much. So then the question is, how much of it is placebo? It may be that a high percentage of the effects people get. Now, there are some powerful drugs that can shut down things, but you know, I think I mentioned last time, there was a study done where these students in the university were given very powerful sedatives and told that they were actually amphetamines. So, a certain number of those people, a significant number, actually their body-brain overcame the effects of the sedative and went on to a high as though they had been given a dose of amphetamines, and vice versa. They did the same thing. And then, of course, some people they gave them and told them they were one or the other, and they were neither. And they still had effects, a certain percentage. Now, it seems that that percentage has been increasing, and I don't know what that means. Does it mean that we've become so medicine dependent that any pill we stick in our mouth, we have an expectation it's going to have some help, and we get help from it? And therefore, if it were a placebo, as this gentleman I mentioned about put on the market, if it's a placebo, is it going to have the same effect? So, to me, it's kind of shaking up the medication industry because, as I say, they have to put a part of the group on placebo and part on the actual drug, and then the effects have to exceed not a whole lot. I've heard of them only being 2 to 3%. Now, how can 2 or 3% be significant enough to really know if the drug works? Almost always placebo is around 40%, or at least it has been. Now there's some indication that it's getting more powerful. So if that were the effect, what really in my mind is happening is that people's belief structure is changing to become so dependent on taking something that putting anything in their mouth that they think is supposed to help them, their mind is helped by it, and hence the body. Now that to me is kind of intriguing. So now what do we find? That we're spending billions of dollars a year for pills and capsules and liquids that we don't even need, meaning they don't have any effect other than what we believe the effect. And if they're nothing placebos, why are they being sold for $20 a pill or $10 a pill? You could make a placebo pill for less than a penny. So something has gone awry, but I think what's happening is that they're being, or will be driven out. I know some of the drugs that were in development have been pulled because they have found that this placebo effect is getting stronger and they can't make a drug stronger than that. Many, many years ago, one of the officials from one of the major pharmaceuticals was being interviewed over in Great Britain, if I recall, and he gave a speech and he had talked about the fact that most medications that are put out on the market, these are from pharmaceuticals, only are about 40% effective for the purpose that they're put out for. Now, on the other hand, if they really are having some kind of effect in your body, they could be and do have some pretty adverse effects. Now, I'm wondering sometimes if we're not on the conscious level, because we're going to talk more and more about the mind-body relationship, but on the conscious level, I have all these wonderings that go on in my mind as I wade through all this material. If, while we're watching a commercial, and you know, those commercials are set up to do mind programming. We didn't talk about that a lot, but we will just a little bit more when we get into this today. But the mind is very programmable, and it can get into certain states where a lot can be done with the programming. Those commercials are designed to actually cause you to be affected to go buy or go to your doctor to buy a particular drug. And it's done very skillfully, but they have all this hype. They change the colors in the background, sometimes going from gray and gray tones to suddenly bright outside. The sun's shining, they're out in the country, the grass is green, the trees are green, the birds are flying, the sky is blue, the sun is shining, there's a few white puffy clouds in the sky, and you're put into a different state as though, wow, if I take this pill, I'm going to feel like that, because of course this person who was looking very droll in the black and white and gray tones, now in the bright sunlight, have this big smile on their face, and the kids are around them, and the parents or the mother or other family members are around, and everybody's smiling and things are great. Now talk about programming. You're being programmed with those. Now once you understand, and there is a good book on the market by Eldon Taylor, Taylor, called Mind Programming. And you need to get it because advertisers understand the principles of mind programming. They understand these influencers and they make use of them. Now in his book, he spends part of the book talking about what it is and how it works, mind programming, and how it can be used detrimentally. And then the latter part of the book, he talks about how it can be used constructively. So it's a very important book to read because it's going to wake you up. And another one that goes along this line that will grab you is called Virus of the Mind by an author by the name of Brody, B-R-O-D, I think I-E. And he has a newer edition of it out because the subtitle on the front page is about the science of memes. And memes have to do with, like he calls a virus. He said that ideas can be like viruses. We have viruses that affect the cells of our body, which are tiny little pieces of DNA or RNA, but it's information that affects us internally, or can. And then there are viruses in your computer, which are binary viruses that can disrupt the function of the computer or direct it off in a different direction, can take it over actually. And then there's viruses of the mind, and they all work the same. So we get an idea implanted in us as like a virus. We then are not only affected by it, but we pass it on to other people. And so when you read his book, he helps you understand what it is and what to do about it. So it follows that same vein as the mind programming from Taylor. So I would say if you want to wake up and get out of the trance that you're being put into by these advertisers, you may want to read both of those books. And on top of it, in the background, they use specific music to affect you also. So in essence, they are generating within you, as you watch this, an altered state to motivate you to go buy it or go to your doctor and ask for it. So if it's over the counter, of course you can go buy your own, but if it's prescription, you have to go to have your doctor. He's the front man for the pharmaceutical that has to write the piece of paper that authorizes you to purchase and take that placebo. And I'm saying that because it's sounding more and more to me like a high percentage of the effect people get is placebo. I know in one of the antidepressants that came on the market, the actual placebo effect was stronger than the medication by a couple of points, but it still went out on the market. And one of the people on that study, or involved in it, had been confined to her house for years, could not go out. She had phobias about going out, she had all this depression, she had all this stuff going on, and so she was chosen as one of the participants. Within 2 days of taking the product that she was given, her depression lifted, she was out shopping, doing all kinds of things as though she never had a problem. Now she knew that she got the new drug. However, when it was looked into, it was found that she had received the placebo. So it was her belief that, this new drug at last is going to resolve my problem. And when she took it, it resolved her problem. But it wasn't the drug. So I'm giving you all this information to get you to start thinking. We have a tremendous health bill in this country because people day by day and night by night are being programmed on the TV to visually and auditorily get this drug because we're going to get speedy relief. And the more confidence we have that these drugs can change our whole life, the more powerful they become. Placebo, placebo, placebo. Now, of course, it can go the other way, and that's nocebo. And I don't know that I got to the story last time, but this is a true occurrence back in the 50s, if I recall. There was a new substance that was brought forward that could be very good for cancer, called crebiazine. Crebiazine was put into a study to determine if, in fact, it could be useful for cancer. So it was done by injection. And so there was a man taken to the hospital in the city, in fact, the very hospital where it was being tested, and he had advanced cancer with tumors all over his body. The outlook was very dismal. In fact, the doctor had pretty well predicted he only had like a week or two left to live. Well, as he was laying there in the hospital and hearing what was going on and so forth, he heard mention of this new experimental medication called crebiazine. So he inquired of his doctor, do you think that that could be beneficial for me? The doctor said, I don't know, but it's in a study right now, and only the participants in the study have access to it. So this gentleman became kind of distressed, and he says, well, isn't there some way you could get me a dose of this? And he said, well, I don't think so, but I'll see what I can do. Well, he was able to get access to the drug, got a dose of it, came in and injected it into this man. By the next day, the tumors had shrunk considerably, and within a few days, they were no longer visible or palpable. So the doctor released him and sent him home, looking like he's cured. Well, 2 or 3 weeks, or maybe several weeks later, suddenly he saw a newspaper article that said, well, we're not so sure about this crebiazine. You know, it may not be as good as we thought it might. And all of a sudden the doctor gets a call from this man saying, did you see that article in the paper? And he said, it may not be very effective. And in no time, he was back in the hospital with his body full of tumors all over again. And so the doctor, realizing by this time that there was something more going on than the drug, says, well, you know what? He said there was some of it that was not up to specifications, and I think that the one you got was one of those. Let me see if I can't get you a brand new run of this medication and get you an injection of it. So he goes, and this time he fills his syringe with sterile saline, and he comes back and injects the guy. By the next day, same thing again. The tumors have shrunk up to almost nothing. In fact, in a few days, they couldn't be found anymore. And so, again, the doctor sends him home and said, in his mind, knowing that it was not the medication, it was the man's mind that had made the change. So, everything is going fine until finally a few weeks later, the final report on crebiazine was, we have found that it's really worthless for cancer, and therefore we're discontinuing our studies. Immediately, the man's body filled full of tumors again. He ended up back in the hospital and died in a few days. Now, what was going on? Now, this is the true story. But that happens a tremendous amount. I say at this point it's extremely difficult to determine whether the effectiveness of a treatment is because it actually is effective or because we believe it to be effective and hence it becomes effective. Now, it's interesting because I mentioned before, I believe, that I have this book that was done several years ago, and it's called 3,000 Years of Mental Healing. And way back in the 1500s, there was a alchemist by the name of Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, better known as Paracelsus. And here's what Paracelsus had to say. Whether the object of your faith is real or false, you will nevertheless obtain the same effects. Thus, if I believe in St. Peter's statue as I would have believed in St. Peter himself, I will obtain the same effects that I would have obtained from St. Peter, but that is superstition. Faith, however, produces miracles, and whether it be true or false, it will always produce the same wonders. Now, this is the comments way back in the 1500s, and this book has 3,000 years of what is called mental healing, or what we might today refer to as mind-body medicine, or psychoneuroimmunology, as it's begun to be called. And now of late, they've tacked on a little bit more. It's now psychoneuroendocrinoimmunology, which means now they realize that the endocrine system is affected also. So it's interesting when you start looking, and the people in these books on the placebo response and the placebo effect in health realized after they studied it. Both of these are medical doctors. One is Howard Brody, MD, and that's B-R-O-D-Y, and a PhD, called the placebo response. You can release the body's inner pharmacy for better health. And the other, the placebo effect in health, combining science and compassionate care, by W. Grant Thompson, also an MD. So some of the doctors are beginning to realize, in fact, the one, Brody, realizes that actually we have built within our system the pharmacy, if you want to call it that, to correct everything if we can access it. And how do we access it? Well, whether it means going and buying a prescription for $300 and taking it and believing it's going to help, or whether it means that we decide, I have already the resources I need. All I have to do is to release those. However, that's not quite so simple. That's where the rub is. Now, as I mentioned, the advertising today, and I was going to tell you earlier, the advertising today is actually programming you. It's programming you that this drug is going to have these certain effects. But you will also notice, while your mind is occupied, your conscious mind, with looking at that ad and being drawn into thinking, wow, if I take that, then I should get better too, or I can prevent having another heart attack, or I can do this, or I can do that. While the conscious mind is highly absorbed with that, then they drop down underneath and they start talking in a almost subliminal voice. This drug, however, could cause blood clots, it could cause a stroke, it could cause a heart attack, it could cause death. Now, does that happen to everybody? No, but my suspicion is that now we're programming the unconscious that the more of you take the drug, the more it's going to harm you because of the nocebo effect. So I believe that we can, at the same ad, be programmed placebo and program nocebo, because of the fact that when we talk a little bit later about something called hypnosis, we find that the whole idea of hypnosis is to kind to grab onto the conscious mind in a way that we can bypass it while it's involved, because all the critical things in our thinking take place in the conscious mind. The unconscious mind does not have a critical capability there, as far as we know, and therefore it accepts whatever it's told at face value and acts on it as though it were true. It does not have that capability to be critical. The conscious mind can analyze everything coming through that we are aware of and reject those things that we don't want to accept. But when we set aside the conscious mind, we can do a lot of interesting things, and there's different ways of doing that. Now, I mentioned earlier that in these ads, it's not only that the visual side, the graphics, catch us and grab our attention, because here we're showing the person looking awful miserable, and in some cases with the antidepressive, they're showing everybody in the whole house sitting around distressed and depressed because someone in the house is depressed. And then we find it all brightens. It's usually dim. Even if it's color, it's still dim. Now, some cases, one of the satins, they advertise with the gray tones, and the guy is sitting there with his head down, and he says, I was blindsided. And I don't want that to happen to you, because I didn't take anything to correct or defend me from a later heart attack. And then after he talks about taking this stuff, he's out in the bright sunshine and the family's there, they're all smiling, they're out in the country. Again, we see the countryside. But behind all of this, they're playing some music and some beats. Now, if you listen to these, you're going to hear that there's a rhythmic beat in the background. Boom, 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 boom. And guess what? You know where else they use beats like that? In some of the areas of the world where they have voodoo dances and where they have these ceremonies that they want to get everybody into a state of mind where they're kind of out of it with what's going on around, and do all kinds of interesting things. And so here we have in the background of the ad this booming music, and almost every ad. I mean, I've just been paying attention to TV in general. I don't watch it a tremendous amount, but when I do, I'm paying attention. And every commercial has boom, 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 boom of some rhythm. Now, it's now known, and it was known since the 50s actually, that certain frequency and rhythms in the background could cause us to become entrained. Now, we hadn't introduced that word yet, but we're talking about mind entrainment. Mind entrainment has to do with the fact that our mind is captured by a rhythm because it's susceptible to certain. And most of them are in the VLF range, which is very low frequency, which means they're down very, very slow, but they have this entraining effect. So your brain will lock on to that frequency, and that's called entrainment. And this has been known about, as I say, since the 50s. Now, the other thing that I read from a sound engineer who was very active in the 50s, it seemed like when all the rock music started coming out, they started doing a lot of experimenting with recording. And one was, they found that in certain frequencies entrained the brain. Now, the natives of certain lands learned this over the centuries, I guess, automatically. And as I say, they incorporate that into some of their ceremonies and so forth, and they can put some out. If you've looked at some of the voodoo type ceremonies, you see that the people seem like they're on a drug. Now, in some cases they may or may not use drugs, but the fact is, music is capable of doing the same thing. There's a whole book by Oliver Sacks. I don't know if you remember Oliver Sacks. You probably do and don't know it you do. Years ago, he wrote a book based on a true story, which was about himself, called Awakenings. And it was very interesting. This doctor gave these people who had been in an ongoing coma for years. They had become unconscious and just slept away in this coma. And so he got the idea if we gave them some dopamine, L-Dopa, which is one of the neurotransmitters, and it's actually an excitatory transmitter. And he gave them L-Dopa, and they came out of their coma. It revived the mind, brought it back to awareness again. And anyhow, his name was Dr. Oliver Sacks. He's from Great Britain. He's been in this country for quite some time. And he's written a lot of interesting books on the brain, mind, and the kind of things that can happen from disturbances. It would be good if you would read some of his books. The first one that ever caught my attention was many years ago, called The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. It sounds kind of bizarre, but it isn't so bizarre once you read the book. And in that, you find all these different cases where some unusual thing that interfered with the brain functioning produced some very strange phenomenon. Or phenomena, we're going to get that right. It produced strange phenomena with all these different people. And things like, well, one lady was being prepared for surgery, and the night before they gave her this large dose of antibiotics, and when she woke up the next morning, she couldn't find her legs. It knocked out a system in the body called the proprioceptor system, which helps you to know where your legs and arms are and have a perception of your whole body. And what it did, for some reason, it decommissioned the proprioceptor system so that she could not stand up without looking at her feet to see where they were, because without her visually seeing them, she no longer had a perception of where her feet were. And it was almost like she lost touch with her body, except visually. If she looked at it, she knew where it was. But if she had her hand out someplace, she had no idea where it was until she actually looked and saw where it was. So there was some very unusual Tourette syndrome is in there. Several unusual things. Anyhow, he wrote a series of books. Awakenings was one, which they made into a movie. And then he wrote several other very interesting ones. And one of his newer ones is called Musicophilia. Tales of Music and the Brain. And of course, down at the bottom it says, author of The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. But he has some very interesting books out if you want to get a good education on the brain and brain function and the kinds of strange things that can occur when the brain is out of commission for whatever reason. Whether it be medication or whether it just be because that it is something has happened to it that they don't know. And in many cases, that's the case. They don't know. But anyhow, they learned a long time ago how music affects. There's a type of therapy called music therapy, that different types of movements and frequencies and so forth actually change or affect the people listening to it. So they do it in hospitals. I mean, there are some, not all of them do it, who utilize music to calm the patients or to put them in a better state of mind or whatever. So it's very important. So what happens is that the advertisers, the actual companies that produce all this, know about all this stuff, and that's what Dr. Eldon Taylor is talking about in mind programming. They're aware of all of it. They know you better than you know you, and they know how to access you to move you to do what they want. And so that was, as I say, discovered way back in the 50s about entrainment with certain frequencies. But beyond that, and this sound engineer that I read from swears that during the time of recording it's possible to actually embed a thought into the recording head and put it in the background, but it's done in such a way that no one knows it's there, and there's not a way to pick it up. Except that when people listen to the music, it plants that thought in their mind. And so if you wanted to move somebody to go buy a particular thing, you could be implanting that while they're listening to the music. And don't forget, if you put the right frequency in, you're in training, so the brain is locking onto it. Now, many years ago, and it's I'm sure still in effect, maybe more sophisticated than before, an acquaintance of mine that's unfortunately now dead was an engineer in electronics, and he had heard that the Russians at the time were actually beaming certain frequencies in, which were entrainment frequencies. So he devised a receiver that he could pick those up. And so they could beam them into a certain area. And what he realized that they were using entrainment frequencies. Now, the thing about entrainment frequencies is that you not only can cause the brain to lock onto that frequency, but then you can modulate the signal and disrupt the person's behavior. So that means that you could take a group of people, like a city, beam it into that city, modulate it with disruptive frequencies that would cause the people to go berserk, like they couldn't think for themselves anymore. Now, and so you would then be able to walk in and take over if you wanted to, because the people wouldn't even be aware of what's happening. They'd be out of it. And so that's called entrainment. And there are some very key frequencies, and this guy's name actually was Dr. Beck. And so he actually learned about them and developed a small device that you could carry in your pocket that gave off a protective field around you for about 3 feet. So it'd be 6 feet across, about 3 feet all the way around, and could protect you from the effect. Now, however, there are a few people who have the ability to reject it. Not a high percentage. I've heard numbers like 3 to 5% of the populace have the capability of not being programmable by standard mind programming techniques. And so I'm saying all this to say that we have tremendous power. The mind has tremendous power, but we don't even realize. Remember last week in the broadcast, I said that studies show that the brain is actually affected by your thinking. In other words, you can change it. Now, I also mentioned that, and they could put an EEG, I should tell you. They put an EEG on that could actually measure the effects of placebo changing or altering brain function. So the fact is, what you think has an effect on how your brain functions. And your brain function determines how you respond to things, whether taking something the thinking is going to help or be very convinced, especially if the doctor who gives it to you is convinced it's going to help, and you take it also convinced that it's going to help. Guess what? You're going to get some effect from that. Now, whether it's actually the drug or your expectation, two different stories. Now, remember that I also mentioned last week that studies indicate that actually surgery completes placebo too. That they did, especially knee surgeries, and did sham surgery, and the sham surgery people were equal to or better than the ones who had the real surgery. In fact, the one individual in one of the studies, the cartilage was seemingly worn out from his knees. Every time he tried to walk, he was in pain, let alone run, so he couldn't run. And after he had the sham surgery, he was out running all over the place with no pain, no problems. And he was totally out of pain because he believed the surgery was going to correct his problem. So I'm saying all this to say we really need to get into understanding how much power we have. Now, I have a lot of material, and I know that we're going to run out of time before we get through all of it. But I wanted to tell you that it goes beyond all this. Here's a book called The Brain That Changes Itself, and it's about neuroplasticity. Stories of personal triumph from the frontiers of brain science. The power of positive thinking finally gains scientific credibility. Mind-bending, miracle-working, reality-busting stuff straddles the gap between science and self-help. Now here's a book written by an MD who's done a tremendous amount of study of the brain and brain plasticity. Now brain plasticity means that the brain reorganizes the way it works. Now I've been in this field of health and personal development and understanding how the body works and the brain works and all this for years and years and years. I mean, it goes way back. I would say, in my case, probably 45 years that I have actually studied way back when the first things started coming out, when the first biofeedback came out, the ability to put electrodes on the scalp and watch the brain waves, ability to measure other reactions in the body, the GSR response, electromyographic response of muscle tension, measuring body heat changes by conscious effect. Years and years ago, I went to New York City to right at the early part of biofeedback. And biofeedback is a way of training yourself to use your mind to affect your body. Very interesting. All the brain needs is some kind of feedback to show you you're accomplishing it, and pretty soon it learns how to do it. And so it was very difficult at the beginning. I mentioned that before with biofeedback, getting people to even want to research it, because everyone knew, because medicine had said that the autonomic nervous system is automatic and there's nothing you can do to change it. So if it's doing something like creating an ulcer in your stomach or whatever because of your stress, nothing you can do about it. You got to take a pill. You can't do anything about that. Well, anyhow, Dr. Neil Miller from New York University finally talked some graduate students into researching, and as they began to research with biofeedback, lo and behold, they proved that you could. First with some rats, and then later with humans. And so this whole new realm came up. However, the problem is with everything out there, we have developed into a time when we want speedy relief. So we want instant. Give me a pill. I don't have time for this. Give me a pill. Well, of course, the pills are killing us because there are some that have some adverse effects. Unless you can generate enough placebo to overcome that, they're destroying people's bodies. Okay, so biofeedback is a way of you taking control. And so we had this huge conference in New York City, and there were people from all over the world. Wolfgang Luther from Germany. We had people from England, all over the United States. I met some of the people that I had read some of their material. And so biofeedback was really taking off. But it wasn't as developed in the encephalograph at the time as later it became very developed. And a lot more studies about the frequencies of the brain function and all kinds of things came out. So what they did with this equipment is you could sit down and you could actually see feedback, getting back to the seeing and the fact, as I mentioned with the commercials, you could see that your brain was influencing a function. For example, if you're all wound up and stressed and all of that, you could put electrodes on that measured galvanic skin response, which called GSR for short. Some people call it galvanic skin response. And there were some other terms for those letters, but bottom line, when you're stressed, it affects you through the autonomic nervous system and causes this underlying tension, eventually blood pressure elevation, eventually accelerated heartbeat. All these things take place, but the stress effect in your body then turns off things. Turns off your digestive tract. It turns off or can affect the heartbeat by speeding it up. It causes what's called the fight and flight response if you get under high stress. It affects the adrenal glands, it affects the brain, the hypothalamus, the pituitary, a whole chain of events. But one of the big things is it depresses the thymus. And the thymus is the activator of the T cells in the body for your immune system. Hence, too much stress, no immune. No immune, you get serious problems. Because only the body can take care of itself. In the final picture, only the body. Many years ago, Dr. by the name of Glasser, who was a consultant to the World Health Organization, was a recognized immunologist, wrote a book called The Body is the Hero. Now he said, no matter what you do, in the final picture, it's the body that does the job. And if you can't utilize the body to do the job, it doesn't get done. There's no medications. And he even said antibiotics. He says probably only once or twice in someone's whole lifetime that you ever need to take antibiotics. Otherwise, if you understand what's going on, you don't need them. Now, I personally haven't had an antibiotic in 55 years at least. I was just counting back a while back when I was young growing up. My parents had taken me when antibiotics first came on the market. Now, remember, I was born BA before antibiotics. The antibiotics, I was born in 1937. Antibiotics did not come into the public market until actually after World War II is when they started to grow. They released some things that had been developed for the military, and then eventually penicillin later came along, and that started the whole realm of antibiotics. But up to that time, there weren't any. But people still lived and they still survived. It's It's almost like we've been programmed to believe without drugs we can't survive. Why do people get so fearful if they think they're going to lose their medical insurance or they're not going to get coverage? I kind of have these drugs. The doctor says I'll die if I don't take these drugs. Well, of course, if you believe that, it's true. If you don't have the drug, you'll die. And remember what I just read from Paracelsus. Whichever you believe, that's what's going to happen. And that was known several hundred years ago. In fact, for 3,000 years it's been known, because that's what that book is about, 3,000 years of the mind-body for mental healing. So, now here we are with all this mess and this tremendous big health bill out there, and we're in big trouble because we can't afford it. And the answer is within us. We have three big things that ruin our health. Number one is the food is missing nutrition anymore. Number two, we have too many stresses that we're unable to deal with. And number three, we're poisoning ourselves to death with the drugs. Because if we had the right nutrition and we learned how to handle the stress factor, we wouldn't have the other factors. Now there is one, I should clarify that. There's something else called epigenetics. Now, epigenetics is something new that's developed. Interestingly, was originally known about by Dr. Christian Friedrich Samuel Hahnemann, the originator of the system of homeopathic medicine. The concept of homeopathic medicine goes all the way back to the Egyptians. But he knew about these miasms, and these are taints that we bring in with us. That's what they were called. A miasm was a taint, and that taint preset you towards certain types of problems. Now, he dealt with it, of course, with homeopathics, but, as I say, no matter what you take, the expectation in you is a major factor regardless. And I've become more convinced of it. Now, I worked many years in hypnosis and working with people, and we saw all kinds of physical changes occur by utilizing hypnosis. One of the most unusual was a few years ago, well, it's been several years ago now, I was contacted by a local broadcaster on TV, and he and his wife had heard that with hypnosis you can enlarge the breasts. And so his wife contacted me then, came in and wanted to know did I think it was true and would I be able to do that for them. And I said, number one, yes, it's true. Number two, yes, I will. So we worked with her for a few sessions and taught her self-hypnosis. And it was only about 3 or 4 sessions. She said her and her husband were very pleased at the results. And she could continue on with her own self-hypnosis if she wanted to continue. Now, whether it can take you beyond what you should have developed, because I know that certain things can happen that arrest the development of breasts in women at the time when they start to go into puberty, and therefore could stop them from developing where they normally would. So whether you're only releasing that, or whether you can carry it beyond that, who knows. But in any case, in her case, they were satisfied. And I've known some other people in hypnosis that did a lot of work in that area. In fact, I knew of one in California did a lot of with celebrities, and he charged $10,000 for each inch increase. I haven't done that. Maybe I should. I could probably have a lot of money, and I could be doing this in a big professional studio and have it all, the money to pay for all that, but I didn't go that direction, and I didn't really push to get into celebrity per se. But I guess if I were out in Beverly Hills, I might do that. I know of a hypnotist that was out there that he got to the point that he charged, I think it was $20,000 or $25,000 for one hypnosis session, and people came and paid it. And they got results. Of course, if you expect if you pay $25,000, you're going to get a lot of results, and I would expect that you probably would get a lot of results. So I guess to pay to prove how well their mind works for them, they were willing to pay $25,000 to make it happen. So we're going to talk a little bit about the mind more. We're running down on time, of course, and that doesn't surprise me. It always is. But I should finish the epigenetic thing, because the epigenetics cause us to bring in things from our ancestry that are not genetic, but affect the way the genes work. Kind of interesting stuff. New field. There's a couple of 3 books out on it now. I met one of the researchers, Dawson Church. He has one. He's a PhD researcher called The Genie and the Genes. But there's more coming out. I mean, more research articles. I just had uncovered one. I don't know if I brought it in here with me or not. I may have. On epigenetics and its effect. Yes. Well, even the genes are saying also, I was looking at that, could have an effect, but epigenetics control the genes. Epigenetics control how they express. You know, years ago they were talking about the Genome Project, that once we can decipher the genetic code of human beings, then we can start doing all these genetic manipulations, and we can put in replacements and do all kind of things. It sounded so simple. A gene for this, a gene for that. You know, they talk about a gene for being fat, a gene for being schizophrenic, a gene for... And they go on and on about the genes. However, what they found was that there wasn't enough genes. I mentioned this before. Whether you remember, I don't know, or whether you heard my broadcast. But they expected to find a minimum of 125,000 genes, and they ended up finding about 25,000. So they were about 100,000 short, and they knew there's at least 100,000 proteins in the body that need to be coded by genes. So now they were in a state of quandary. How can that be? If we only have 25,000 and we need at least 100,000 for our proteins, how can we make them? And so what it ended up was that it became obvious as time went on that the whole genetic thing is not that simple. It's a library of pieces of information. Now, something tells the body or the nucleus of the cell which of those groups of genes to pull out to do what needs to be done. So it's like, okay, in a library we're going to talk about cardiology or the heart. Okay, I've got this book and this book and this book and this book on cardiology. I had to make the decision what books I want to pull out or what aspects. Do I want to look at cardiography? How do we measure the heart? Do I want to look at heart function and the physiology of the heart? Do I want to look at the anatomy of the heart? Do I want to look at the electrical system in the heart? Do I want to look at the relationship between the heart and the brain? You know, there's all these things. Now, today I may want to pull 2 or 3 or 4 of these together to do something I have in mind because I can bring it together. So here we have this big genetic library of 25,000 genes, and some signal goes to the cell and tells the cell, okay, let me in, I've got information for the DNA. It goes to the DNA in the nucleus, and it triggers a gene to express. When that gene expresses, then it triggers another 2 or 3 genes, which in turn trigger another 2 or 3 genes, and it's those genes that come together to carry out what the original signal required. So now how do you put a gene in that's going to change all that? Especially if you don't even understand what's the signal like for sure that signals this whole process to begin. So whether the signal is coming from without or from within your mind or from in your epigenetic recording. Now, when we come in with this epigenetic information, where is it? It's not in the genes, but we get it from our parents and our grandparents and so forth. So where did it come from? And where is it being held? Well, I guess the closest thing to it is that it's like an energetic imprint, like a recording. You know, when you record a video on a piece of recording tape, the information is turned into electromagnetic signals which affect a layer of iron oxide on this tape and rearrange the molecules to hold the information. Now, when we want that information back, we run it through a machine which reads this code back off of the tape, converts it into electromagnetic signal, which in turn converts it into pictures and sound, and now we have a video picture coming back. So where was it? In between. it was on this piece of tape. But where was it on the tape? You couldn't see it, but it had to do with the way it rearranged the molecules of iron oxide to hold the information. Now today we're doing it a little bit differently. Instead of rearranging the molecules, we're burning into a plastic disc, like a CD or a DVD. We're burning it into there, and that's where the information is being held. In and of itself, the information doesn't do anything until it's read. And so we have to have a reader to read that information back and then transform it into an active signal that does something. So it could be giving you a picture, it could be controlling an electronic process, it could be doing a lot of things, but we're storing the information. So our bodies bring in the stored information from our parents. And that stored information is being stored within the cells. Now, a few years ago, Candace Pert wrote a book called Molecules of Emotions, and they're called neuropeptides, and those carry information throughout the whole body, and it appears that the unconscious is stored through every cell throughout the whole body. And if you get bad information with a lot of bad emotional energy and you store it in your liver, you may end up with some bad liver problem, because that bad information is going to produce some bad results. So I'm throwing in some things. I want you to see the bigger picture. We're talking about a lot more than just, wow, here we have this placebo effect. But they don't go into, the people who talk about that in general, don't go into, well, what are all the ramifications? And it has to do with mental states, and it has to do with what's happening with you, how you respond to it, and how much of that is so disturbing to you, it gets recorded in your body, and your body, mating with another person, brings these pieces of information together and passes them on to offspring. And so, you know, it's interesting that the Bible said the sins of the father shall be visited to the third and fourth generation of children. A lot of people looked at that and, what does that really mean? Well, it sounds to me like we're actually having it recorded and it's affecting us. So, whatever that information is that gets recorded in you then can be passed on, and that's epigenetics. Epi meaning above or around. So it's not in the genes. So how are you going to change the epigenetic? We don't even have a reader to read it. Only the body can read it at this point. So if we can't read it, how are we going to intervene? Because changing a gene does not change this whole process. But what it might do, it might interfere and create a whole new problem. So it's almost like we have to be careful we don't get into a Frankenstein type situation where we're creating a monster because we don't even understand the whole process. Now there's a lot of research being done, but it's going to be a long time before, and I don't know if we'll be able to develop a reader to read it. The body can read it. The body has that capability. And so it is so far advanced above what we know at this moment. Now, there's a lot of things I could talk about, but I don't want to get it too advanced. I don't want to get you too scared. But as I say, I've been studying this stuff for probably 45 years, and I've watched all the advances that have come out. Now, it's becoming evident that what we only theorized in natural medicine before, now bit by bit is being proven by regular medical and scientific research. Just like all kinds of effects of information. Because there's other ways to imprint information into the system. One is we can bypass the brain and put it directly in the unconscious, and then the unconscious, according to Pert, she thinks is every cell in the body. That's where all the memory is of everything. So the programs are all put in there. And it explains a lot how families have these problems that come up, yet it's not genetic in nature, but they develop the same type of problems because they come in with the program already programmed in to set things in motion to make it happen. Now there are ways to clear that. You know, it's not a dismal picture. There are ways, but it's not going to be with drugs. It's going to be with a change of mind. And so now we get into some interesting things like extraordinary healing. A book written by an MD called The Amazing Power of Your Body's Secret Healing System. Very good stuff. It just goes into tremendous amounts of things that we don't have time to talk about. The whole groundwork of this, I just should show you this, was written many years ago by Maxwell Maltz, who was an MD plastic surgeon, and he noticed changes in psyche when he changed the physical body. And it was called Psycho-Cybernetics, the original book, and now they've updated it. This one is now called Psycho-Cybernetics 2000, the complete update of his classic book called Psycho-Cybernetics. I remember when they came out way, way, way back. That was one of those early books that I read along the way. But we're getting so muddled today because there's so much stresses and so much pressure. We don't even have time to even get in and talk about all of that. But here's another good book called Who Gets Sick. I had mentioned it before, how beliefs, moods, and thoughts affect your health. Goes into some of the same ideas. And The Divided Mind, called The Epidemic of Mind-Body Disorders by Johnny Sarno, MD. All of these are, we're not talking about some dubious guy with sandals and jeans and a ponytail. Not that I'm against that, but people have this idea that if you're not into drugs and surgery, then you're with this other group, which when I was younger they used to call health nuts, that are wasting their time because they're not taking real medicine. But anyhow, this is new stuff. And the book by Greg Braden called The Spontaneous Healing of Belief, Shattering the Paradigm of False Limits. It reminds me of some of the material of Dr. John Lilly. I mean, at some point, we're going to go through, I guess, in detail, the whole transition that's been occurring in this century. Actually the latter part of the last century and into this century, and give you some very good information on what, if you want to get a good education and understanding life and health and all these things, then that's some of the material to get. Here's another very good one, The Healing Power of Neurofeedback, which is neurological biofeedback. The revolutionary lens technique for restoring optimal brain function. We've got a lot of stuff put out now by Dr. Amen out of California, who's a psychiatrist that uses a SPECT scanner that is a 3-camera scanner that produces an image on the TV of the brain in 3 dimensions, and you can rotate it, turn it upside down, and every which way. And you see holes in the brain where the brain's not functioning in that area. And different areas of the brain carry on different functions. And so the bottom line is, from what we're bringing you today, there are some interesting things you can do. One is, you've got to change your eating and get real food in your body that not only is bringing energy from the soil, but bringing micronutrients and all those things, and not filling you full of pesticides and chemicals, and that the plant itself has not been modified in such a way that your body doesn't know what to do with it. In other words, genetic modifications. And that's happening more and more. The whole idea is to create a product that you can't duplicate. You have to come back to them to get it and take control of the food. And that's happening a lot. So that's the one thing, is you got to get good food, and you got to get the missing nutrients into your body, because it's not going to work right without them. And then you got to deal with the stress factor. And of course the stress is you can't get rid of it because it's all around. All you can do is change your way of thinking related to it. Now there is an organization I've mentioned before out of California called the Heart Math Institute. For 20 years plus they've been researching the heart and its relationship to the body. They have now developed some equipment. It's mentioned on my website. In fact, there's a page of resources for personal development. And there's a banner there called about the M-Wave, E-M-W-A-V-E, which is a piece of equipment that will measure a certain response in the body called heart rate variability. And with that system, you can train yourself to keep your body calm in the midst of all of the things that are going on around. And when you do, your whole chemistry changes. So between changing your diet and changing your response to stress, You then become in control of your body. And there's other things you can do beyond that we don't even have time to talk about today, but you can carry it further. Now, it all has to do with states of consciousness, which again is pretty much a whole subject in itself. Many years ago, Charles Tart wrote a book called States of Consciousness, where we switch back and forth to different states and go into a certain entrained state when we watch commercials on TV and therefore being programmed to go buy the drugs or to carry out surgery, get liposuction to take off your fat so you can, why waste your time changing your diet and doing all that? We can give you instant removal of fat. However, I've seen a lot of those people down the road afterwards, when they put back on more than they took off. I've seen with stomach bypasses, they ended up putting on more than what they took off from the surgery. All kinds of things going on. It goes way back to a statement that was made many years ago that change your thinking, change your life. And so we have to understand and apply and take care of our own selves if we really want to be healthy. And we have to understand these states of consciousness. We didn't really get into detail about hypnosis, but with hypnosis, as I say, you can do all kinds of physical things. It was started by a doctor, actually, in France years ago, way back in the 1800s. And it was called, actually 17s, I think, actually the late 17s, early 1800s. His name was Antoine Mesmer, and from his work, he found that people got well from all kinds of things. And later, he ended up, not himself, but people started calling it mesmerism because of Mesmer. And as time went on, it became hypnosis from the Greek word hypnos, which means sleep, but hypnosis isn't really sleep. Sleep is a state of mind. Unconsciousness from drugs is a state of mind. Relaxation, meditation, I mean, all these things are different states of mind, and there's a lot of studies on all those and what they can do to the body. So that material is all available out there. Yeah, we just can't possibly cover it all, except we try to tweak your interest and give you some resources so you can find out about it. Now, if you get on my website, mindyourhealthcast.com, and go to the personal development or personal resources and go to the banner for M-Wave, it will take you to the HeartMath Institute, and on there's going to be a free download of the whole idea about the heart and what it does. But you can buy this whole system that works in your computer, and a small unit you can carry in your pocket that once you're training yourself to stay calm in all the stress, if you feel yourself in unusual circumstances, you can put your thumb on this unit and it will show you your heart rhythm that is out of sync, which is called an incoherent rhythm. And in just a moment of synchronizing your breathing with your heart, you can calm it right back down and level it out so that you can deal and you're not overstressing your body. You're not overstressing the hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal axis and constantly having your body uptight and rigid and causing your blood pressure to go up and all these problems. You can calm it all down because you have the capability. So I hope I have given you enough to kind of challenge you to go out and find out about all this, because as I say, there's a tremendous amount out there, and ultimately we are in charge. It's us and our body, and we can't depend on some pharmaceutical to put out a drug that's going to change our life. Now, they will put out a drug that they'll sell to you if you're really willing to go buy it, and if you're willing to live with all the adverse effects. And as I say, I'm not so sure that they're not even programming them in worse because of the way they staged the commercial. So at any rate, then of course then they can give you another drug for the adverse effects. Unless it kills you, then you're all finished anyhow. You can move on to another level. It was nice being with you. We've used up our time as usual. Don't forget to go to our website, mindyourhealthcast.com. If you've not been there before, you can register there, not to be flooded with emails to sell you something, but to announce each week what our broadcast is going to be about and or any changes that might be going on in our website. On our website, you can also click a link that takes you to the Alternative Health and Prevention, which is my office where I do therapy with people based on natural medicine. I operate in Florida as a doctor of Oriental medicine, and We've been in the natural health field for almost 40 years. So it was nice being with you again. I think I'll have an interesting broadcast for you next time. I've been working on it already. It's fascinating to me, and I hope it proves as fascinating to you. It was nice to be with you again. Until next time, be healthy.